Locked away like a wild beast, the giant widow endured the fearful stares and the stones hurled at her cage until a solitary Apache saw her weep in silence. With his savings, he bought her freedom and asked, "Will you marry me?" The desert wind of Sonora whistled through the rotting beams of the traveling circus, and it carried a smell that had become Maria's entire world. It was the smell of sweat, dust, and cheap liquor, so constant it was like breathing itself. She woke as she did every morning, with her shoulders aching against the low, splintered ceiling of her prison. 3 years. 3 years she'd been forced to sleep curled like an unborn child, her knees nearly pressed to her chest, her arms crossed over her body like she was already in her coffin. The straw mattress, thin and crawling with things she tried not to think about, groaned under her impossible weight. She had learned to be still. For hours, she would stare at the wood grain above her, listening to the circus come to life. First the horses, then the grunts and curses of the workers, and finally, the sound she hated most, the cruel, sharp laughter of Don Teodoro as he counted the coins from the night before. His voice would boom across the tent, a daily ritual of her humiliation. "Come see the cursed Giganta," he'd bellow. "The woman who crushed her own man with her bare hands." Maria squeezed her eyes shut, her massive fists clenching so tight her nails bit into her palms. 3 years of those exact words, and they still cut her open like it was the first time. Santiago had never been her man. Not really. He was just an animal handler who saw her size, her strength, and thought he'd found a workhorse that wouldn't cost him anything. He'd seen a useful monster, strong enough to haul equipment and work from sunup to sundown without a word of complaint. But that night he had been different. Drunk, yes, but something else coiled underneath his usual brutishness. He wasn't just angry, he was terrified. He'd been shouting about debts, about a man who would take her anyway if Santiago couldn't pay. He'd raised his hand to her, not for the first time, but this time she pushed back. Just a shove. Nothing more. But she had the strength of 3 men, maybe 4. Santiago flew backwards. He didn't just fall. He hit the corner of a heavy wooden crate, and the memory always ended the same way. The dry, sickening snap, like a dead branch breaking under a heavy boot. She hadn't killed her husband. She had defended herself from her cellar. But the truth didn't make for a good story. A monster did. 4 reales to witness the most terrifying spectacle in the world. The voices of the crowd were getting closer now, a river of footsteps and excited chatter. Maria sat up, a slow, painful process. Her vertebrae popped and groaned after a night spent twisted in on herself. Her hands, large enough to palm a man's head, trembled as she tried to smooth her tangled black hair. She wanted to face them with a shred of dignity, even if they saw none. The first stone hit the bars at exactly 10 o'clock. The metallic clang was a physical blow to her chest. More followed, a rain of pebbles and insults. "Look at the size of that thing! Is she even a woman? They say she can rip a man in half just by looking at him." Maria kept her head down, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had learned this trick the hard way. Any reaction was a victory for them. If she cried, they roared with laughter. If she raged, they screamed louder, their faces twisted with a strange mix of fear and delight. If she dared to meet their eyes, some would flinch. But others, the cruelest ones, would just get bolder. Silence was her only armor. It was a thin shield, but it was all she had. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," Don Teodoro's greasy voice boomed, silencing the crowd, "observe how this creature, this thing, pretends to be human." The short, fat man waddled toward her cage, holding a long, sharpened stick. He used it to shove her food through the bars, to poke her ribs, to treat her exactly like the animal they all believed she was. Today, he banged the stick against the bars right next to her face, making her flinch. "Stand up, monster! Show the good people how big you are!" Against her will, Maria lifted her gaze. Her eyes scanned the sea of faces and landed on a small girl, maybe 5 or 6, perched on her mother's hip. The child wasn't screaming or jeering. She was just watching. Her eyes were wide with a pure, simple curiosity, and for a split second, a crack of light appeared in Maria's dark world, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. But then the mother saw the silent exchange. Her face soured with disgust. She turned her daughter's head away and whispered loudly, "Don't look at it, my love. It's cursed by the devil." The hope died instantly, snuffed out like a candle in the wind. The show, as he called it, lasted for 2 agonizing hours. When the last of the crowd had shuffled out, leaving behind the smell of peanuts and sweat, Maria was left alone with the echoes of their mockery. Don Teodoro came back, his fat fingers adorned with cheap, gaudy rings, stuffing coins into a leather pouch. "A very good day," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "People will always pay to see a freak." He tossed her ration onto the dirty floor of her cage. A piece of bread so hard it could break teeth, a chipped bowl of murky water, and a tin plate of cold, congealed beans. Then he was gone, the jingle of his coins fading into the distance. She ate slowly. Every bite was deliberate. It wasn't about pleasure. There was no pleasure left. It was about control. This small act, the act of eating, was the only part of her day that belonged to her. As she chewed the stale bread, her mother's words came back to her, a whisper from another lifetime. "My daughter," her mother had said, her voice full of a sad, confusing love. "God made you different for a reason. One day you will understand why." But her mother had died before she could explain, and her family, terrified of her unnatural size, had cast her out when she was only 14. Every job she ever found ended the same way. The fearful looks, the whispers behind her back, the inevitable dismissal. Only Santiago had seemed to accept her, and in the end, he had been trying to sell her. He had hurt her, too. "Why?" she whispered into the empty, dusty air of the tent. "Why did you make me like this?" The wind picked up, rattling the rotten wood of the circus wagons. It almost sounded like an answer. But Maria had stopped believing in answers a long, long time ago. Far up in the hills that overlooked the town of Sanadoro de la Fonta, a man named Tonatu watched smoke curl from the chimneys below. He was 51, but he carried his years like a heavy, wet blanket. It wasn't a physical weariness. It was the weight of a soul that had lost every single thing it had ever loved. He was an Apache warrior, but the wars were mostly over. He had built his small ranch right on the edge of the world, a place where he could see the town without ever having to be a part of it. He needed to know what the white men were doing, but he had no desire to join them. For 10 years, he had lived on this border, a man caught between 2 worlds, belonging fully to neither. His scarred hands, hands that had known the grip of a knife and the gentleness of a woman's touch, rested on his belt as he watched a new caravan roll down the main road. It was a traveling circus. You could tell by the gaudy, peeling paint on the wagons and the strange, tinny music that the wind carried up the hills. The bright, garish colors made him think of his wife. Etel. She had loved bright colors. Reds like a desert sunset, blues like the sky after a storm, yellows like ripe summer corn. She had woven blankets with those colors, blankets he'd had to burn the night after they buried her. The sight of them was a pain worse than any physical wound. The circus set up its tents in the town square, a festering sore on the face of the desert. For 3 days, Tonatu listened from his perch on the hill. He heard the roar of the crowd, the gasps of delight, the waves of laughter. He didn't go down. He almost never went down. Only when he needed supplies he couldn't hunt or grow himself. But on the 4th day, something changed. The wind brought a different sound. It wasn't laughter. It wasn't awe. It was something deeper. heavier. A muffled sound, like someone trying to cry without making a noise. It was a sound so faint, so buried beneath the noise of the circus, that only a man who had learned to listen to the whispers of the desert could have heard it at all. Tanatu swung himself onto his horse. But he didn't ride. He dismounted a mile out and approached the town on foot, moving with the silent, deadly precision he'd learned over decades of war. He slipped between the shadows of the buildings like a ghost. His mind switched to a mode he hadn't used in years. He was infiltrating enemy territory. And what he saw when he finally peered through a tear in the main tent stole the breath from his lungs. In the center of it all was a cage, and inside the cage, hunched over like a wounded animal, was the largest woman he had ever seen in his life. She was a giant. But it wasn't her size that struck him, not really. It was the way she held herself, the way her shoulders were curled inward, protecting something broken inside, the way her eyes were locked on the dirt floor, as if she was afraid to look up. It was the desperate, crushing stillness of someone who had learned, through terrible pain, that any movement, any sound, only made things worse. Tanatu knew that posture. He'd seen it in men his tribe had taken as prisoners. He'd seen it in horses that had been broken by a cruel master, and if he was honest with himself, he had felt it in his own body in the empty years after Itel's death. "Come see the cursed Giganta!" shrieked a short, greasy man with rings on every finger. "The woman who killed her own husband!" The crowd laughed. They pointed. They threw scraps of food and trash at the cage. A young boy, no older than 10, picked up a small sharp stone and hurled it. It bounced off the bars, inches from her face. And the woman didn't even flinch. She didn't cry out. She didn't protest. She just seemed to shrink further into herself, becoming smaller and smaller until she was almost nothing at all. Tanatu felt a rage ignite in his chest, a feeling he hadn't known for a decade. It wasn't the hot, explosive rage of battle. This was something colder, sharper, more dangerous. It was the fury of a righteous man witnessing an injustice so profound it screamed for vengeance. But as he watched, he saw something else in her too, in the way her massive hands were clasped in her lap, in the proud, straight line of her back even as she hunched, in the silent, unbreakable dignity of her suffering. He saw another soul that mirrored his own, someone who had lost everything, someone judged and condemned for something they couldn't control. Someone who had learned to eat pain for breakfast and swallow it down without a sound. He stayed there, hidden in the shadows, until the last of the crowd had gone home and the ring-wearing man had pocketed his dirty coins. He watched as the woman was given her pathetic meal, and he saw the way she ate it, as if every single bite was a sacred ritual. He watched as she tried to curl her enormous body onto the thin straw mattress, a puzzle of limbs that could never find comfort. That night, Tanatu rode back to his ranch under a cold, star-filled sky. But he couldn't sleep. The image of her was burned into his mind. When he was a young man, the elders had taught him something he had long since forgotten. They said that sometimes the spirits place a person in your path, not for your sake, but for theirs. They said that a warrior's true worth isn't measured by the enemies he kills, but by the lost souls he helps find their way home. For 10 years, he had let those teachings get buried under the weight of his own grief. But tonight, seeing her, he remembered who he used to be. Not just a warrior, a protector, a man who could not, would not stand by and watch the innocent suffer. At the first hint of dawn, he saddled his horse. He went into his house and pulled a loose stone from the fireplace. Behind it was a heavy leather pouch filled with silver coins he'd been saving for 10 years. He had never known what he was saving it for, until now. Don Teodoro was hunched over a rickety table, counting his profits again, when he saw the stranger approaching. The man was tall, his skin the color of rich earth, his long black hair tied in a single braid that fell over his shoulder. His clothes were simple: a plain cotton shirt, leather trousers, boots that were worn thin from years of walking. But there was something in the way he moved that made Don Teodoro's blood run cold. He walked like a panther, each step silent, deliberate, and full of a deadly purpose. And his eyes, they were as black and hard as obsidian. They didn't roam around the circus with the usual curiosity of a visitor. They locked directly onto Don Teodoro and didn't waver. In that single, unblinking gaze, the circus owner felt like he was being weighed and measured by something ancient and far more dangerous than himself. "Good morning," the man said, his voice low and steady. His Spanish was perfect, but there was an accent there, something from the mountains. "Good morning, my friend," Don Teodoro replied, forcing a greasy smile onto his face. "Here to see the show? The Giganta is a sight you will never forget, I promise you that." "I've come to talk business." The words were spoken so calmly, so quietly, that for a second Don Teodoro didn't understand. Then he let out a short, nervous laugh. "Business? My friend, this is a circus, not a bank. What kind of business?" The man didn't answer with words. He untied the heavy leather pouch from his belt and placed it on the table. The sound it made was unmistakable. A heavy, solid clink of silver. A lot of silver. "I want to buy the woman." Don Teodoro just blinked. He must have heard him wrong. "Buy her? Senor, you must be joking. The woman is not for sale. She is my star attraction. She is my... Everything has a price." The man's tone hadn't changed, but the absolute finality in those 4 words froze Don Teodoro's next sentence in his throat. With a trembling hand, he reached out and opened the pouch. His eyes went wide. He'd never seen so much silver in one place. It was more money than he'd made in the last year. How much is here?" he stammered. 300 pesos. Don Teodoro's mind raced. 300 pesos. He could buy 2 new attractions for that. Maybe a trained bear or a family of acrobats. He could leave this dusty town and start fresh somewhere new. His fat fingers caressed the cold, heavy coins. A thought suddenly struck him. But why? Why would you want her? What in God's name do you plan to do with her? For the first time, a flicker of something that looked like emotion crossed the stranger's face. It was a cold, hard fire in his eyes. "Free her." The words hung in the air. Don Teodoro let out another nervous bark of laughter. "Free her? Senor, you don't understand. That woman is a killer. She crushed her own husband. She's dangerous, a monster. You can't just..." "Were you there?" The question cut through his frantic words like a knife. "Did you see what happened?" "Well, no, but everyone knows the story." "Everyone says many things," the stranger said, his voice dropping even lower. "Few people ever know the truth." Don Teodoro looked at the silver. Then he looked toward the dark, silent tent where Maria was waiting for the day's torture to begin. He'd only paid 50 pesos for her 3 years ago, right after Santiago's accident. The local sheriff had been all too happy to get rid of the problem. She'd been a very profitable investment. But 300 pesos? That was life-changing money. An idea, slick and ugly, slithered into his mind. A way to keep the money and maybe even get rid of this dangerous stranger. "She's more than just dangerous, senor," he said, leaning in conspiratorially. "She's unnatural, cursed. Sometimes at night I hear her talking, whispering, to things that aren't there, to demons, I think." He watched the stranger's face, expecting to see fear or disgust. He saw nothing. The man's obsidian eyes just stared back at him, unimpressed. "If she is so cursed," Tonatu said calmly, "then you should be happy to be rid of her. 300 pesos is a generous price for a demon." Don Teodoro's bluff had failed. He was trapped. He looked at the silver one last time. "Fine," he spat. "Fine, but I want her gone. Now, Before the evening crowd starts to arrive. I don't want any trouble." The man gave a single sharp nod. He turned and walked toward the tent, and Don Teodoro scurried after him, clutching the heavy pouch of silver to his chest. He still wasn't sure if he was making a brilliant deal or the biggest mistake of his life. Inside the tent, Maria was curled in the corner of her cage, as far from the entrance as she could get. She heard the footsteps, and her entire body went rigid. Visitors outside of showtime were never a good thing. It usually meant Don Teodoro was drunk or bored or both. "Maria," Don Teodoro said. His voice was strange. It was softer than she had heard it in 3 long years. "This man, he wishes to take you with him." She lifted her head, a slow, painful movement. Her eyes met the stranger's, and in that moment, something passed between them. It wasn't recognition. They had never met. It was something deeper. It was as if 2 old, wounded souls had finally found each other across a crowded, cruel world. "Take me where?" Maria asked. Her voice was a dry, rusty whisper. She so rarely spoke that the words felt foreign in her own mouth. "Far from here," the man replied, his voice a low rumble, "to a place where you can live in peace." Peace. The word was so alien she could barely comprehend it. She studied him, her gaze sharp and assessing. 3 years in this cage had taught her how to read people, how to smell a lie, how to see the rot behind a smiling face. But in this man's eyes, she saw no deception. She saw no pity, which would have been even worse. She saw something she had not seen directed at her since she was a small child. She saw respect. "Why?" she whispered, the single most important question of her life. The man hesitated, as if he was weighing how much of the truth she could handle. Finally, he spoke, and the words were simple, but they landed with the force of a physical blow. "Because everyone deserves to be free." With a key that trembled in his fat, sweaty fingers, Don Teodoro unlocked the cage. He had carried that key on a chain around his neck for 3 years, a symbol of his ownership, his power. Now he fumbled with the lock, his eyes darting nervously between the giant woman and the silent Apache. The iron door swung open with a long, mournful creak. Maria just stared at the opening. It was an impossible rectangle of light in her dark world. An illusion. A trick. For 3 years, she had dreamed of this exact moment. In her dreams, she would burst through the door, roaring with righteous fury. But now that it was real, she couldn't move. Her body was frozen, anchored to the spot by the weight of 1,000 days of captivity. "Come," the man said again, his voice gentle. He took a step closer and extended his hand toward her. It was a large hand, strong and scarred from a life of hard work and old battles. But it wasn't trembling. It didn't recoil. It didn't show any disgust at the thought of touching her. "You are free now." She looked at his offered hand for what felt like an eternity. Slowly, hesitantly, Maria lifted her own. Her hand, the one they called monstrous, the one they said had crushed a man's skull, reached out and touched his fingers. The contact was like lightning, a jolt of warmth and life that shot up her arm and straight into her heart. She hadn't touched another human being without violence, without pain, in 3 years. Her eyes filled with tears, hot and sharp, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of him, not in front of Don Teodoro. "You are free now," he repeated, his voice firm and steady as a mountain. And with those 4 words, Maria felt the iron chains that had been wrapped around her soul for a decade finally shatter and fall away. The journey up into the mountains passed in a strange, thick silence. Maria rode behind Tonatu on his horse, a powerful beast that was used to carrying heavy loads. Still, she could feel the animal straining beneath their combined weight, and the old, familiar guilt gnawed at her. She was too much, too big, too heavy for this world. "I weigh too much," she murmured after a couple of hours, her first words since leaving the circus. "Perhaps I should walk." "The horse is fine," Tonatu answered without turning his head. "You need to rest." It was the first real conversation they'd had, and she was surprised by how natural her own voice sounded. After 3 years of near-total silence, she'd half wondered if she had forgotten how to speak at all. The landscape began to change. The flat, dusty plains gave way to rolling green hills, and finally to rugged mountains covered in pines and oaks. The air grew cooler, and it smelled of damp earth and wild things. Maria inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with a clean, sharp scent that was the exact opposite of the circus. It was the smell of freedom. "What is your name?" she asked when they stopped to let the horse drink from a clear, rushing stream. "Tonatu, Tonatu," she repeated, tasting the Nahuatl name on her tongue. It felt ancient and strong. "It means sun." He turned to look at her then, a flicker of surprise in his dark eyes. "My grandmother was Purhepeka," Maria explained, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "She taught me words from the old tongues." "And you?" he asked, his voice softer now. "What is your true name?" "Not the one the circus man called you." "Maria Xochitl." "Xochitl," he said, the word sounding like a prayer. "It means flower." She lowered her gaze, staring at her own massive hands. "My mother said she hoped I would be as beautiful as a flower. She was disappointed." "Your mother was wrong." The words were spoken so simply, without a trace of pity or flattery, that they took Maria's breath away. He wasn't trying to comfort her. He was stating a fact, a truth he saw as plainly as he saw the mountains around them. For the first time since she was a little girl, someone looked at her and didn't see a monster. He saw a flower. They reached his ranch just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and blood red. Maria had expected a crude hut, something rough and primitive. But what she saw surprised her. The house was not large, but it was sturdy, built from stone and thick, dark wood, and the ceilings were high enough for her to stand up straight without stooping. Wildflowers grew all around the porch, planted in a way that looked natural but was clearly cared for. Behind the house, she could see a neat, thriving garden of corn, beans, and squash. "It's beautiful," Maria said, and the word felt small and inadequate. "It was my wife's," Tonatu replied, his voice flat, but Maria heard the ocean of grief hidden beneath the surface. "She planted the flowers." The way he said it told her not to ask any more questions about his wife, not yet. Maria understood the sacred borders of grief. She had her own to guard. He showed her to a room at the back of the house. It was simple, but it was clean. There was a bed, large and sturdy enough to hold her weight without groaning, a small table and a solid wooden chair, and a window that looked out over the garden. "For me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It is yours. For how long?" "For as long as you wish to stay." That night, for the first time in 3 years, Maria took a real bath. Tonatu heated water in huge pots over the fire and filled a large metal tub for her. He gave her a bar of soap that smelled of pine needles and wild herbs, and a stack of clean, soft towels. As she sank into the steaming water, the dam she had built inside herself finally broke. She wept. She wept for the 3 years that had been stolen from her. She wept for the humiliation, the stones, the jeering laughter. She wept for Santiago, not because she had loved him, but because his violent death had become the story of her life, a story she had never chosen. She wept for the family that had thrown her away, for every door that had been slammed in her face. But then, something shifted. She began to weep for the feeling of hot, clean water on her skin, for a door that she could close and lock from the inside, for the quiet dignity of a man who had looked at her and said, "You are free now." and had actually meant it. She wept until there were no tears left inside her. When she came out of the bath, she found a set of clean clothes laid out on the bed. They didn't fit perfectly, he must have guessed at her size, but they were clothes for a woman, not a spectacle. A long skirt of dark blue cotton, a simple white blouse, and even a pair of sturdy leather shoes, big enough for her feet. She dressed slowly, marveling at the simple, forgotten pleasure of clean fabric against clean skin. When she stepped out into the main room, she found Tonatu in the kitchen, cooking over the wood stove. The air was filled with the rich, comforting smell of chili and warm tortillas. "It smells delicious," she said softly. "Are you hungry?" It was such a simple question, but Maria realized with a sudden jolt that she didn't know how to answer. For 3 years, she had eaten when food was thrown at her. She had drunk when water was provided. No one had asked her what she wanted or how she felt. "Yes," she said at last, the word feeling new and powerful on her tongue. "I am hungry." They ate at the small kitchen table, and it was the best meal of her life. The beans were seasoned with spices that woke up parts of her palate she'd thought were dead. The tortillas were warm and soft. There was even fresh goat cheese. "Do you always cook this well?" she asked, a genuine smile reaching her eyes for the first time. "My wife taught me," Tonatu replied, his gaze distant for a moment. "She said a man who cannot feed himself properly cannot take care of anyone else." She was a wise woman. "Yes," he said, his eyes meeting hers across the table. She was. After the meal, Maria stood to clear the dishes, but Tonatu shook his head. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tonight, you rest." Back in her room, Maria lay on the bed and stared out the window at the brilliant spray of stars in the black desert sky. She couldn't remember the last time she had been in a room big enough to stretch out her arms, to stand up to her full height, to close a door and be truly, completely alone. For the first time in 3 years, Maria Xochitl fell asleep without being afraid. The first weeks at the ranch were the hardest Maria had ever known. It wasn't because of the work. Her large, strong hands were made for labor, and the rich mountain soil seemed to welcome her touch. It wasn't the loneliness either. After 3 years of being constantly watched, stared at and judged, the simple gift of privacy was a luxury beyond words. No, the hardest part was the kindness. Tonatu asked for nothing in return. He expected no fawning gratitude. He didn't treat her like a fragile, broken thing that needed to be pitied, nor did he treat her like a strange curiosity. He simply treated her like a person. And Maria had no idea how to accept it. Every time he handed her a cup of coffee in the morning or complimented the way she tended the garden, a part of her flinched, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the trick, the betrayal. But it never came. He would leave to hunt for days at a time, and she would work in the garden. The same hands that Don Teodoro had called devilish and monstrous proved to be astonishingly gentle with the growing things. She had a touch, an instinct. She could feel when a plant was thirsty, when the soil needed turning, when the roots were strong and ready. Under her care, the corn stalks grew taller than a man, the bean pods grew fat and full, and the squash turned a deep, sweet orange. "You have a gift for this," Tonatu said one afternoon, watching her from the porch as she carefully weeded a patch of herbs. "My grandmother kept a small garden," Maria answered, her voice still quiet, as if she was afraid of it. "She taught me when I was a girl. Before—" Her voice trailed off. She didn't have to finish the sentence. Before she got too tall, before she became different, before the world looked at her and decided she was a monster. One morning, as Maria was watering the young corn, she heard voices, not just Tonatu's, but others, speaking in a language she didn't understand, the sharp, guttural clicks of Apache. Every muscle in her body went tight with the old, familiar instinct of a caged animal. company meant danger. Three figures emerged from the forest path that led to the ranch. An old woman with long gray hair braided with silver beads, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles. A middle-aged man whose face was scarred from old battles and whose eyes missed nothing. And a young girl, no older than 16, with eyes that were bright and full of a fearless curiosity. They all stopped short when they saw her. Maria felt a cold dread wash over her. She slowly, deliberately, rose to her full, towering height, bracing herself for the inevitable. The gasps, the whispers, the fear. But the old woman didn't gasp. She didn't even seem surprised. She just looked at Maria, her dark eyes sharp and intelligent, and gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if Maria was exactly who she had been expecting to find. "So," the old woman said, her Spanish as clear and perfect as a mountain stream, "this is the one. The woman Tonatu saved from the circus." "Grandmother," the young girl began in Apache, but the old woman held up a hand, silencing her. "We will speak Spanish," she said firmly, "so our guest can understand." She stepped forward, her stride steady and full of an authority that had nothing to do with size. "I am Citlali, the healer of our people. This is my son, Nakoma, and my granddaughter, Itel." Itel. The name was like a key turning in a lock deep inside Maria's chest. Tonatu's wife's name. "It means star in Nahuatl," the young girl explained, offering a shy, hesitant smile. "And you? What is your name?" "Maria Xochitl." "A beautiful name," Citlali said warmly. "A flower. May I ask you a question, Maria Xochitl?" Maria nodded, steeling herself for the usual barrage. "Why are you so big? Is it true you killed a man? What does it feel like to be a freak?" But Citlali's question caught her completely off guard. "Do you know the medicinal properties of the plants you are tending?" Maria just blinked. "What?" "The chamomile you've planted around the squash," Citlali said, pointing with a gnarled finger. "It is good for calming the stomach and helping with sleep. And the cumin, next to the corn, that is excellent for digestion. Did you plant them this way on purpose?" Maria hesitated, her mind racing. "My grandmother. She taught me that some plants like to grow next to each other. She said they helped each other grow strong. I didn't know they were medicine, too." Citlali smiled, a deep, knowing smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Every garden is a medicine cabinet, child, if you know how to see it. Would you like to learn?" And that was how Maria's real education began. Citlali started coming to the ranch 3 times a week. She would arrive with baskets filled with strange roots, dried leaves, and mysterious seeds. She taught Maria the names of all the wild plants that grew in the mountains, in Spanish, Apache, and Nahuatl. She showed her which parts to harvest, which moon to harvest them under, and how to dry and store them so their power wouldn't fade. "You must understand," Citlali told her one afternoon, as they were grinding herbs together to make a salve for burns. "The knowledge of plants is sacred. It is passed down from woman to woman, from healer to healer. But the gift of making them thrive, that is different. That comes from the earth itself. It is a blessing." "A gift?" Maria whispered the word. "All my life, people have told me I am a curse." Citlali stopped her grinding and looked Maria dead in the eye. Her gaze was so intense, it felt like it could see right into her soul. "Child," she said, her voice low and fierce, "have you ever seen a mountain apologize for being tall? Have you ever heard a river beg for forgiveness for being deep?" "No," Maria breathed. "Then why should you apologize for being as the earth made you?" Maria had no answer. Itel started visiting more often, too. At first, she always came with her grandmother, but soon she started venturing up the path to the ranch on her own, her initial shyness replaced by an insatiable curiosity. She asked Maria a million questions. What was it like in the circus? Had she ever seen the ocean? What were the white settlers' towns like? "I've never been beyond our people's land," Itel confessed one afternoon as they sat together shelling beans. "My parents say the world outside is too dangerous for us." "It can be," Maria admitted, the memories of the cage rising up like a bad dream. "But it can also be beautiful. And there are good people out there, like your Uncle Tonatu." "He isn't my uncle by blood," Itel explained. "He was married to my mother's sister. But my grandmother, Sitlali, she says that the truest family is the one you choose, not the one you are born into." "Your grandmother is a very wise woman." "She says you are wise too," Itel replied, her young face completely serious. "She says that anyone who has suffered as much as you have and can still be so gentle with growing things must have a very old and wise soul." That night, Maria told Tonatu about her day with Sitlali and Itel. "Your sister-in-law is intense," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. For the first time, Tonatu gave a real, genuine smile in return. It transformed his face, chasing away some of the shadows that always lingered in his eyes. "Sitlali says the plants knew you were a healer long before you did," he said. "She says that's why they grow so well for you. They recognized one of their own." "Do you believe that?" Maria asked, her voice barely a whisper. Tonatu looked at her for a long, quiet moment. He looked at her strong, gentle hands, at the newfound light in her eyes, at the way she seemed to finally be unfolding, like one of her own flowers reaching for the sun. "I believe there are many ways to heal in this world," he said finally, "and I believe the earth gave you a gift." That night, Maria lay in her bed and thought about seeds and roots and plants that stretched toward the sky without ever apologizing for the space they took up. And for the first time, she began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she could learn to do the same. Over the next few months, Maria's garden became her sanctuary and her purpose. It expanded far beyond Tonatu's original modest plot. With his help, she cleared more land, creating 3 distinct sections: one for plants that healed wounds and eased pain, another for those that fought fevers and settled troubled stomachs, and a third, quieter section for the herbs that could calm a racing heart and bring sleep to the sleepless. News of her garden and her touch spread through the Apache community like wildfire. At first, it was just the elders who came, their old bodies stooped and aching. They would come to her shyly, asking for something for the pain in their joints. Maria would prepare a salve of arnica and willow bark, and its effects were almost miraculous. Word spread. Soon, mothers were bringing their sick children to her. Maria had a special way with the little ones. Perhaps because she had felt so small and helpless for so long, despite her size. She knew how to be quiet, how to move slowly, how to make them feel safe. She would sweeten the bitter medicines with a drop of wild honey and tell them stories while they drank. But not everyone accepted her. There was a young warrior named Jaot, his face proud and his eyes full of suspicion. "She is not one of us," he would mutter to the other young men, just loud enough for Maria to hear. "It is not natural for a woman to be that size. The spirits do not make mistakes like that." "She is a bad omen," his friend Militika would add. "Since she arrived, the rains have been scarce, and my own wife has been unable to conceive." The familiar sting of rejection, the poison she thought she had left behind in the circus, pierced Maria's chest. But this time something was different. She didn't shrink away. She didn't hide. She remembered Sitlali's words. "Have you ever seen a mountain apologize for being tall?" She held her head high and continued her work. The real test, however, came with the storm. It rolled in from the west without warning, a furious beast of black clouds, lashing rain and howling wind. And in the middle of it all, a child went missing. A little girl named Paloma, no older than 4, the daughter of Jaot. The mother's desperate wails were nearly drowned out by the thunder. Nakoma, Sitlali's son, burst into Maria's home, his face pale and tight with fear. "Have you seen Paloma? She wandered off this morning before the storm hit. We've searched everywhere." Maria looked out her window at the woods. The trees were thrashing violently, their branches like whips. "Let me search," she said, her voice calm and steady. "It's too dangerous," Nakoma argued. "The river is already flooding its banks. The paths are slick with mud." "I am strong," Maria interrupted, her voice leaving no room for argument. "And I am large. I can go where others cannot." Without waiting for another word, she pulled on a heavy cloak and stepped out into the raging storm. For 2 hours, she battled the wind and the rain. She called Paloma's name until her throat was raw. Her size, which had been the curse of her life for so long, now became her greatest asset. She pushed through thickets of thorny bushes that would have torn a smaller person to shreds. Her height allowed her to see over the dense undergrowth. She waded through rushing streams that would have swept anyone else off their feet. Finally, she saw it, a flash of red cloth under the roots of a huge fallen pine tree. She scrambled down the muddy bank and found the little girl, huddled in a small hollow, shivering, soaked to the bone, and terrified. "Paloma," Maria said, her voice soft and low, the way she spoke to frightened animals. "It's me, Maria. Your mama is looking for you." The child stared up at her, her eyes huge in her small, pale face. You're the giant." "Yes," Maria said, a gentle smile touching her lips. "I am very big, but I promise I will not hurt you. Are you hurt?" Paloma shook her head, her tiny body still trembling violently. Maria took off her own warm, dry shawl and wrapped it carefully around the child. Then, as gently as she handled her most delicate seedlings, she lifted Paloma into her arms, holding her close against her chest. "Are you cold?" "A little. Let's get you home. Your mama will make you some warm chocolate." As Maria carried her back through the storm, the little girl slowly began to relax in her arms. She snuggled closer to Maria's warmth. "You're soft," Paloma murmured, her voice sleepy. "And warm." She was quiet for a moment, and then she asked a question that stopped Maria in her tracks. "Aren't you afraid of me?" Maria blinked, completely stunned. "No, little one. Why would I be afraid of you?" "Because I was afraid of you?" Paloma said with the brutal, simple honesty of a child. "At first. But you don't smell like a monster. You smell like flowers." When they finally emerged from the woods, a collective gasp went up from the villagers who were huddled together, waiting for news. Paloma's mother ran to them, her face streaked with rain and tears. She snatched her daughter from Maria's arms, covering her with frantic kisses. Then, to Maria's utter astonishment, the woman turned and threw her arms around Maria's waist, hugging her tightly. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Spirit bless you. Thank you for bringing my baby back." Later that night, after the storm had passed, the tribe gathered around a huge, crackling bonfire to celebrate Paloma's safe return. Yayot came before the entire tribe and stood in front of Maria. He did not speak. He simply bowed his head in a gesture of profound respect and gratitude. For the first time since she had arrived, Maria was invited to sit in the inner circle, close to the warmth of the flames and the heart of the community. Sitlali stood and spoke, her voice ringing out in the clear night air. She spoke first in Apache, and then she repeated her words in Spanish, so Maria would understand. "This woman," she said, her eyes finding Maria's in the firelight, "has shown us the heart of a true Apache. She risked her own life to save one of our own." Nakoma then stepped forward. "You are a true mother to our people," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Our tribe honors you." Tears streamed down Maria's face, catching the firelight like diamonds. But for the first time in her life, they were not tears of pain or shame. They were tears of belonging. Much later, when most of the others had gone back to their homes, Tonatu came and sat beside her by the dying embers of the fire. "How do you feel?" he asked softly. Maria looked up at the vast, star-dusted sky, then at the glowing coals, and finally at the face of the man who had changed her life with a single, inexplicable act of kindness. "Like I'm finally home," she whispered. And it was the simplest, truest thing she had ever said. 2 years passed, and they were the best 2 years of Maria's life. She was no longer Maria the giantess, the circus freak. She was Maria Xochitl, the healer of the Sierra Roa. She and Citlali worked side by side, their knowledge combining to create remedies that were known for miles around. People came from all over, not just Apache, but Mexican settlers from the town, even the occasional American prospector who had heard tales of the miracle worker in the mountains. Her garden was her kingdom, a sprawling, fragrant paradise of healing and life. But the deepest changes were not in the garden. They were happening quietly, subtly, inside the small stone house she shared with Tonatu. It began in moments so small she almost didn't notice them. The way he would look at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. A look of quiet admiration and something else, something warmer. The way their conversations in the evenings stretched longer and longer, moving from polite questions about the weather to shared stories of their pasts, their pains, their quiet dreams. They worked together in a comfortable, easy silence, moving around each other as if they had been doing it for a lifetime. One night, after a great harvest festival, Tonatu walked with her through her garden under the light of a full moon. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and the earthy smell of her herbs. "Maria," he said, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. "Yes? Are you happy here?" The question caught her by surprise. It wasn't the words themselves, but the tone. His voice was laced with a vulnerability she had never heard before, a fragility that told her this was more than just a simple question. "Happier than I ever believed was possible," she answered, and it was the honest truth. Would you stay? Permanently?" Maria stopped walking and turned to face him. The moonlight softened the hard lines of his face, and in his dark eyes she saw a flicker of the same fear and uncertainty she had lived with for so many years. "Are you asking me to stay as your healer, Tonatu?" she asked softly. "Or as something more?" He took a deep, shaky breath, the sound loud in the quiet night. "As my wife, if you will have me." The words hung in the air between them, as delicate and beautiful as a spider's web covered in dew. "Tonatu?" Maria's voice was a whisper, full of all her old fears. I am too large. I am different. People will always stare. They will always talk." "Let them talk," he interrupted, his voice suddenly strong and fierce. He stepped closer and took her enormous hands in his. They were dwarfed by hers, but his grip was firm and steady. "The people who matter, our people, they already love you. And I—" He looked up at her and his eyes were shining in the moonlight. "I love you exactly as you are, not in spite of it, because of it." Something inside her chest, something that had been clenched tight and frozen for 30 years, finally broke open and let the light in. I never thought anyone could love me," she whispered, the words choked with unshed tears. "And I never thought I could love again after Etel," Tonatu confessed, his voice raw with emotion. "But you healed more than just the people of this village, Maria. You healed me. You showed me that a heart can break, and it can grow back even bigger than before." Under the stars, surrounded by the healing scent of the garden she had built with her own 2 hands, they kissed. It was a kiss that sealed 1,000 unspoken promises. A month later, they were married. The ceremony took place not in a church, but beneath the open sky, in the old Apache way. Citlali had woven Maria a beautiful blue rebozo and had embroidered it with the images of all the healing plants in her garden. The children of the tribe, including a healthy, happy Paloma, carried armfuls of wildflowers and built a colorful, fragrant altar where Maria and Tonatu exchanged their vows. "I promise to honor you," Tonatu said, his voice clear and strong for all to hear, "to protect you, and to walk beside you until the mountains turn to dust." "And I promise to love you," Maria replied, her own voice filled with a joy so powerful it brought tears to everyone's eyes. "To care for you, and to use my gifts to serve our family and our people for all of my days." When Citlali, acting as the elder, pronounced them husband and wife, a great cheer went up, and the celebration lasted until the sun rose over the mountains. There was music and dancing and feasting, but the real celebration was happening quietly, in Maria's own heart. Then one day, years later, a wagon rattled up the path to the village. A family of settlers, their faces etched with worry, had brought their daughter. She was 10 years old, but she was already nearly as tall as her own father, her shoulders hunched in a permanent cringe of shame, her eyes fixed on the ground. Her parents explained that they had taken her to every doctor they could find, desperate to find a cure for her unnatural size. No one could help them. Maria's heart clenched with a painful, familiar ache. She saw herself in that girl, trembling and hiding behind her mother, trying to make herself invisible. We heard there was a healer here," the father said, his voice cracking with desperation. "Someone who helps with special conditions." Maria walked toward them, slowly, gently. The little girl looked up, and her eyes went wide, but it wasn't with fear, it was with pure, unadulterated wonder. You're like me," she whispered. "Yes," Maria said, kneeling down so she could look the child in the eye. "I am like you." She reached out and gently took the girl's hand in her own. "Being big can hurt sometimes," she said softly. "I know, but it can also be a wonderful, beautiful thing." "How?" the girl asked, her voice small and full of a desperate, fragile hope. Maria smiled, a deep, genuine smile that lit up her entire face. "Come," she said. "Let me show you my garden. I'll show you all the amazing things that big, strong hands can do." They walked together through the rows of herbs and flowers, and Maria told her everything. She taught her the names of the plants and their secrets. She told her about the tribe that had become her family, and about the man who had seen a flower where everyone else had seen a monster. And she told her the most important thing of all. "You are not too big for this world," she said, looking down at the young girl who was her past and her future. "The world is just too small, and it is up to people like us to make it grow." The girl and her family stayed for 3 months. When they finally left, the girl walked tall, her head held high, a smile on her face. "Someday," she told Maria as she hugged her goodbye, "I'm going to help other girls like us." "I know you will," Maria replied. That night, Maria sat on the porch with Tonatu, her hand resting on her own swollen belly, where their first child was growing. They watched the stars come out, listening to the song of the desert. "What are you thinking about?" Tonatu asked, his hand covering hers. Maria smiled, remembering the words her mother had spoken to her so long ago, words she had never understood until now. God made you different for a reason. "I think," she said softly, "that I finally understand why." From far off in the darkness, a lone coyote howled at the moon. It was a wild and beautiful sound, a song of freedom. To Maria, it felt like a blessing. If you were moved by Maria's journey from a caged spectacle to a beloved healer, and you believe in the power of kindness to change a life, then don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We have more incredible stories of justice and redemption coming your way.